The winter of 1941 arrived like an invisible beast, creeping across the Russian plains, waiting for the right moment to strike. The German troops, who months earlier had marched victoriously across Europe, now marched across the frozen wasteland of the East, believing nothing could stop them. There were more than 3 million men, machines, horses, tanks and trucks, a torrent of iron and fire that seemed unstoppable. But no one was prepared for the enemy that would come from the grey sky and the biting wind, the Russian winter. The roads, once dirt, became rivers of frozen mud. The ground creaked under the weight of boots, and each step sounded like the grinding of bones breaking. The tank engines, which had roared mightily in June, began to cough and die, paralyzed by the ice. Oil hardened inside the metal blocks, radios went silent, and guns jammed as if the steel itself feared the cold. The soldiers, dressed only in light summer uniforms, felt the cold creep up their legs, seeping through the fabric, biting into their skin like invisible teeth. Many slept, hugging their rifles, trying to soak up the remaining warmth within them and never waking up. Their eyelids were frozen solid, their fingers turned black, and their faces, covered in frost, looked like wax masks. The once swift and relentless advance now lumbered to a crawl. Trucks lagged behind, horses fell on the ice, and men collapsed exhausted by the roadside, turning into statues of frozen flesh. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of explosions or the muffled cries of soldiers for help, a sound that the wind quickly drowned out. On the horizon, Moscow seemed close, almost within reach, but it was a cruel illusion. Between them and the Soviet capital stood an invisible, merciless force, cold, hunger, and despair. The young faces of the Wehrmacht, once brimming with confidence, now reflected fear and doubt. The enemy, they realized, was not just the Red Army, it was Russia itself. And as the ice gathered on their helmets and the wind roared through the dead trees, the soldiers understood the terrible truth. That road did not lead to glory. It led straight to white hell. If you want to know how history really happened, subscribe and follow every chapter. As German soldiers shivered and froze to death in the vast Russian countryside in his secure barracks, Hitler remained blinded by arrogance. He fervently believed the war would be won before the snow touched the ground. His conviction was almost religious. The Führer brooked no error, not even in the face of nature. To him, winter was merely a detail, a passing inconvenience compared to the grandeur of the Third Reich. The generals warned him. They said the Russian cold was relentless, that Napoleon had learned that the hard way. But Hitler, with his steely gaze and fervent voice, responded with contempt. The German army is invincible. Moscow will fall before Christmas. And so, the order was given. Keep moving. Forward. Commanders at the front knew what this meant. Fuel was running low, roads were becoming ice traps, and supplies of winter clothing simply didn't exist. German factories still churned out lightweight uniforms, while men on the front lines burned maps and newspapers to try to stay warm. Boots were torn. Socks were replaced with rags ripped from looted Russian curtains. Soldiers wrapped rags around their hands, trying to hold the frozen metal of their guns without their skin sticking to them. Every shot was a struggle, every movement torture. But Hitler's orders were clear. Do not back down, never. The Führer's pride was worth more than the lives of his men. In the makeshift shelters, officers murmured silently, no longer about victory but about survival. Letters from home arrived with the scent of bread and warmth, and the soldiers' eyes welled with memories. The empire that had promised to last 1,000 years now trembled in the shadows of snow-covered forests. Meanwhile, Stalin smiled bitterly in Moscow. He knew the enemy was trapped in the trap his own pride had built. Hitler had declared war on Russia, but now he faced an enemy no army could defeat: the winter. And on the silent white plains, where the wind roared like a hungry animal, German pride began to shatter, one soldier at a time. The cold is no longer just a nuisance. It has become a silent killer. The thermometer has plummeted to 40 degrees Celsius, and what had once been mere snow was now a wall of deadly ice. The wind cut like blades. Each blast seemed to rip the souls from men, sucking the heat from their bodies until only pain and despair remained. The tank engines, once proud steel monsters, began to die one by one. Oil froze in the pipes, fuel hardened like wax. The Panzer tanks, which had traversed Europe, crushing everything in their path, now lay motionless, petrified giants in the middle of a white desert. Each morning, hundreds of vehicles were left behind, abandoned like rusting carcasses. The rifles and machine guns refused to work. The iron stuck to the skin like a trap. One wrong touch and a chunk of flesh would come with it. The soldiers learned quickly, never put their tongues, faces or bare fingers to the metal. Some, desperate, tried to heat their weapons with their own urine, while others simply prayed that the enemy would suffer the same torment. Inside the frozen trenches, men shivered uncontrollably. Their breath came out in thick clouds that turned to ice. On their faces, the wounded, without medical supplies, died slowly, not from bullets, but from freezing. Blood, when spilled, hardened almost instantly, creating a dark crust on the snow. It was as if the Russian ground were drinking the invaders' blood. The officers were trying to maintain discipline, but how could they command an army that could barely stand? Starving soldiers chewed on leather ripped from belts, tried to melt snow for drink, and dreamed of fresh bread, while the wind howled like a chorus of ghosts. One morning, a scouting party came upon a horrific scene. A row of German soldiers frozen in place, their eyes open, their hands clutching their rifles, dead, but still seeming to watch the horizon. The cold had paralyzed them in mid-vigil, turning them into ice statues. The message was clear. The invisible enemy now reigned over the front. The first wave of death had arrived, not from Stalin, nor from any human weapon, but from Stalin himself. Russian winter, and what had once been the greatest invasion force in history, began to crumble under the weight of the snow, an entire army suffocating from the cold. Russia's roads, long, winding and unforgiving, had become veritable death rows. What had once been simple dirt paths was now a treacherous crust of brittle ice, mercilessly swallowing men, horses and machines. The Germans, accustomed to advancing over the asphalt and fields of Western Europe, now trudged along trails that resembled natural traps. Trucks, loaded with supplies, got stuck in frozen ditches, breaking through the ice and overturning with their drivers still inside. The dry crunch of metal mingled with the sound of muffled screams, and soon the silence returned, heavy, deadly. Those who managed to escape the cabs fell to the ground, trying to run, but the cold reached them first. The wind came from the steppes like a curse. It blinded, hid the horizon, and erased entire trails. An entire army could vanish in the whiteness of a blizzard, as if it had never existed. It was common for entire patrols to be found days later, frozen solid, their faces covered in a thin layer of ice and their eyes staring blankly into space. The dead piled up on the roadsides, stacked like logs. The living no longer had the time or energy to bury them. Each morning, the soldiers passed their former comrades, transformed into grotesque monuments of ice. Each body a cruel reminder that winter spared no one. Ambulances could no longer move, tires shredded, engines exploded, and the wounded were left behind, covered only by thin blankets that froze within minutes. Many begged for a final shot to escape the agony, but ammunition was too precious even for mercy. And then came the famine. Supply lines were cut by the weather itself. Rations froze before reaching the front. Men broke off chunks of ice to suck on, only to feel something in their mouths. Some cut flesh from dead horses, eating it raw, stiff, as the wind roared around them. The taste was bitter, and the despair indescribable. At night, the cold became even more brutal. The sound of chattering teeth echoed inside the tents. The crackling of ice sounded like gunshots. And when the sun rose, there were always more bodies, motionless, covered in white. soldiers who had simply stopped resisting. Russia's hell didn't have fire, it had ice, and in that vast white desert, the cold was the invisible executioner that silently reaped men without needing to fire a single bullet. Enjoyed the story? Subscribe and join us as we uncover the battles that changed the world. While the Germans were devoured by cold and hunger, in Moscow, a silent and shadowy figure watched everything with eyes as cold as ice. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, often accused of brutality, now became the personification of resistance. He knew the enemy was weakened. He knew that winter, his new ally, was doing the work that even his generals had failed to do. From his Kremlin headquarters, Stalin sent a message that echoed throughout the Soviet Union, a short, dire, non-negotiable order. Not one step back. Nemam paso atrás. That phrase became law, engraved in the heart and mind of every soldier. To retreat was treason. To flee was death. It was not only a military order, but a spiritual one. The entire Soviet people rose up. Peasants, workers, women and children, all transformed into soldiers by the force of necessity. In Moscow's factories, the sound of hammers and furnaces never ceased. Even under bombardment, workers produced weapons, ammunition and tanks, often with their own frozen hands. Women sewed uniforms late into the night, using scraps of curtains, blankets and animal skins. Each piece of fabric was a promise of survival. Red Army soldiers received these rudimentary clothes and set off for the front, covered in rags but filled with fury. This wasn't just a war against the Germans. It was a war for the very soul of Russia. They knew what was at stake: their homes, their families, their homeland. In villages near the front, peasants hid mines under the ice and set traps for invaders. Children acted as messengers, carrying notes between Red Army units. Old women wielded rifles left by dead soldiers. It was an entire country fighting, not for glory, but for revenge. And Stalin, from his darkened room, watched with grim pride. He understood what Hitler could not. Winter was no obstacle. It was a weapon. Nature, geography and suffering were now on the Soviet side. While the Germans shivered in the frozen forests, the Russians moved like shadows. They knew every bend, every frozen river, every shelter. For the invaders, the cold was a curse. For the Soviets, it was invisible cloak of the homeland protecting them. And so, as the bitter wind blew over the ruins and the ice covered the dead, Russia silently whispered an ancient promise, a promise made in blood and ice. You came to conquer, but here you will be buried. From December 1941 onwards, the snow is no longer just a scenery. She became a living weapon, a white army, silent and relentless. With each new blizzard, the Germans lost not only their bearings, but also hope. The landscape had become a deadly veil, hiding traps, Soviet troops, and even death itself. The German soldiers, exhausted and their eyes stinging from the glare of the ice, couldn't tell where the ground ended and the sky began. Everything was white, borderless, directionless. Maps were useless. Compasses froze. Patrols were lost in a silence that felt like a vacuum. No sound, no life, only the distant howl of the wind. About that, the Red Army adapted perfectly. Dressed in white cloaks, Soviet soldiers became shadows camouflaged in the snow. They moved silently, crawling like ghosts. An entire detachment could suddenly appear, fire and disappear without a trace, as if the earth itself had spewed fire and then swallowed the men back. At night, the attacks became nightmares. The flares of rockets would momentarily illuminate the endless whiteness, and then the red figures of Soviet infantry would appear, running amidst explosions, bayonets drawn, shouting, "Hurrah!" with a force that cut through the silence like thunder. The Germans fired blindly, but their shots echoed in the void. They didn't know where the attacks were coming from, nor where to shoot. The snow hid everything. It hid the bodies, the buried tanks, the lost supplies. It even hid the traces of defeat itself. A German commander wrote in his diary, We fight an enemy we cannot see. Snow is their uniform. The cold is their ally. They are not men. They are specters of Russia. And it was true. The Red Army had merged with the terrain itself. The cold and snow became part of Soviet strategy. They dug tunnels under the ice, made holes to shoot through, and vanished like smoke. With each German advance, more and more soldiers were swallowed up by that seemingly endless white blanket. Bodies disappeared, covered in minutes. Trails were erased by the wind. The snow, Stalin's invisible army, did its work relentlessly. And so, while the Germans drowned in despair, the Soviets rose with unshakable certainty. That winter was no accident. It was an ancient revenge made of ice, silence, and blood. Every week, a new battle. Subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Chaos on the German lines. The White Apocalypse. The German front, once a monument to Teutonic order, a machine of precision and relentless might, had disintegrated not merely into despair, but into a silent white hell. Discipline, the sacred pillar of the Wehrmacht, was not merely disintegrating. It was actively eroded, molecule by molecule, by the acid of cold, the torture of hunger, and the omnipresence of death, which had become as commonplace as the ceaseless falling snow. The supply lines, the jugular veins that pumped life into the war machine, were necrotic, frozen, and ruptured. Food was no longer available. Fuel was solidifying into a useless amber paste. And hope, that invisible fuel of the soul, had evaporated, leaving behind only the icy vacuum of annihilation. Men who had crossed Poland and France in weeks, chins held high and the arrogance of victory in their eyes, now moved like creatures from a Bruegelian nightmare. They were staggering specters, grotesque caricatures of the soldiers they had once been. The Kar-98K rifle, once a symbol of power, was now a cross of iron and wood, a dead weight they dragged through the snow. The simple act of raising the weapon for the night watch was an epic battle waged in the recesses of a dying will. Their legs, atrophied by malnutrition and exhausted by superhuman exertion, trembled with a violence that prevented them from standing still. Their once proud Aryan faces were now swollen, purple masks of pain, disfigured by frostbite blisters that burst, revealing the black flesh beneath, and by never-healing wounds, gaping and festering beneath the tattered uniforms that offered no more protection than a shroud. The cold, an invisible predator, had seeped into their bones, into their blood, freezing not only their bodily fluids, but their very thoughts, replacing strategy and tactics with the single primal obsession, surviving the next hour, the next minute, the next breath of Siberian wind. The Grand Army of the Reich, the scourge of Europe, was rotting on its feet, devoured from the inside out by an enemy that had neither flag nor general. Communications, the nervous system that connected the command's brain to the army's members, suffered a sudden and silent death. Radios, their batteries turned into blocks of ice, were nothing more than a useless weight on the operators' backs. Orders, when they arrived, were ghostly echoes from a world that no longer existed, carried by messengers setting out on a suicide mission. Many were found weeks later, frozen in their Zundap motorcycles, macabre statues of duty and futility, or simply disappeared, swallowed by blizzards that appeared out of nowhere with the fury of an angry god. It was a systemic collapse, the silent shutdown of a war machine that believed itself perfect and eternal. In the husks of Russian villages, officers who once dined with silverware in French castles now acted with the desperation of cornered animals. Doors were ripped off, sacred icons were desecrated to fuel bonfires that spewed more smoke than heat. The izbas, the wooden houses that for centuries had sheltered Russian life, became dens of agony. Inside, in the dim light dimly lit by a makeshift oil lamp, soldiers with hollow, feverish eyes shared a single moldy loaf of bread with the solemnity of a last communion. The final act of degradation was to boil the leather of boots, belts, anything chewable. The nauseating smell of rubber and burnt leather mingled with the sweet odor of gangrene, creating the characteristic perfume of that hell. A young soldier from Munich, no more than a boy, could be seen vomiting violently after his first leather meal, her tears freezing instantly on her dirty face. The horses, the noble creatures that had pulled the cannons and supplied wagons for thousands of miles, disappeared with alarming speed. Their bodies, when found, were quickly butchered with bayonets and combat knives. The flesh, hard as marble, was chipped away and melted over the flames, an unholy sacrifice. A veteran sergeant who had fought in World War I was seen stroking his horse's head, whispering apologies before delivering the fatal blow. He ate his fill that night, but his eyes never again betrayed any emotion. The cold was an impartial reaper. Dawn brought not the relief of the sun, but the confirmation of more losses. Sergeants, their faces covered in ice, passed through the trenches and makeshift shelters, shaking the men. Some simply did not move, their bodies frozen in the position they slept. Death had become so common that the main concern was removing the corpse so it wouldn't occupy space that could be used by a living person. A soldier might wake to find the man beside him dead, his body radiating a chill that seemed to suck the heat from the room. In command posts, the veneer of authority was cracking. Officers, once impeccable in their uniforms, now wore rags and stolen blankets. The certainty of victory had been replaced by the certainty of annihilation. They knew they were doomed, but the regime's discipline and fear were so deep that surrender was unthinkable. One general, looking at a map that had become useless, was heard muttering to himself, "We have been abandoned by God and Berlin." Madness was contagious. The constant bombardment, hunger, cold, and the incessant vision of death shattered even the strongest minds. Soldiers were struck by white fever, a condition in which the snowy expanse exerted a hypnotic and deadly allure. They would strip naked and run into the steppe, laughing and singing as if they were going to a festival. They were found days, later ice sculptures with a frozen smile on their faces, a terrifying image of peace. And in this abyss of chaos, a dark epiphany spread like a virus. The war was no longer for the fatherland or the Führer. War had been reduced to its purest, most brutal form, a desperate, individual struggle for the next heartbeat, the next sip of dirty water, the chance to feel the faint warmth of the sun once more. The army that had seen itself as the vanguard of a new era was now nothing more than a horde of dying men crawling away from the enemy they could not defeat, the Russian winter itself. The Eastern Front, the stage destined for the coronation of the Third Reich, had become its mausoleum, a white, endless cemetery where Germanic arrogance was buried under a meter of snow. If you respect those who fought, join us, subscribe, and keep their memory alive. As the Wehrmacht drowned in an ocean of ice, Moscow, the cursed and coveted city, rose like a citadel of fire and defiance. December 1941. The heart of the Soviet Union, which the world expected to stop beating at any moment, pulsed with a primordial fury. The air of the capital was a cacophonous symphony. The oily smoke of the fires, the ice crystals that cut into the face, the smell of burning metal, and a fear so thick it could be chewed. But for the first time in 6 months of retreat and disaster, this fear was being burned by a new emotion, an ember that refused to go out. Hope. The sirens, nicknamed Stalin's mourners, wept, their mournful song day and night, a sound that had become woven into the fabric of Moscow life. In the night sky, Luftwaffe Heinkel and Junkers bombers loomed like ominous insects, their ominous drone followed by the piercing whistle of falling bombs. Explosions ripped through the city, turning apartment buildings into craters, decapitating the golden domes of Orthodox churches and tearing gashes into factory walls. But Moscow did not break. Even before the shrapnel stopped raining, teams of civilians, mostly women and teenagers, were rushing toward the inferno. There was no panic in their movements, only a grim, determined efficiency. They put out fires with buckets of water and sand, dug through the rubble with their bare hands in search of survivors, and with holy stubbornness patched what could be patched. The flames that consumed their homes were not a sign of defeat. They were torches that lit the path of resistance. The Kremlin, the ancestral fortress of the Tsars, and now the brain of Soviet defense, had disguised itself. Its red walls and iconic towers were painted with bizarre camouflage patterns, a desperate attempt to confuse bombers. Lenin's mausoleum was covered by a wooden structure to protect it. But behind this facade, the iron will of the regime remained intact. Stalin, in his wood-paneled office, had rejected all suggestions of evacuation. His presence in the city was a message more powerful than any speech. With a calm that bordered on the supernatural, he spoke on the phone with his generals, especially with the newly arrived Georgy Zhukov, the man in charge of the miracle. "The retreat is over," his deep, guttural voice echoed. "Not a step back. Moscow will be the anvil on which the hammer of the Red Army will crush the invader." In the streets and parks, an epic transformation was taking place. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites, men too old for the front and women whose strength seemed inexhaustible, dug into the frozen earth. The anti-tank ditches known as Stalin's Smiles stretched for miles, a challenge of earth and ice to the Panzers. Children, their faces red from the cold, formed human chains to pass sandbags, their small bodies contributing to the defense of the homeland. The factories, some still being built while already producing, were the beating heart of the city. Workers, fueled by hot tea, brown bread and patriotism, operated their machines in 12, 14 and 16-hour shifts. They slept on cots beside the assembly lines, the deafening roar of the presses, and hammered their lullaby. It was the sound of survival, the rhythm of a city that refused to die. The spirit of "not a step back" permeated every citizen. Workers' militias, the Opolchenia, marched through the streets armed with whatever was available. University professors learned to operate Maxim machine guns. Philharmonic musicians filled bottles with gasoline to make Molotov cocktails. The defense of Moscow was not just a military operation. It was an act of collective will, the decision of an entire city to fight to the last man, woman, and child. And then a new ally joined the fight, an ally as old as Russia itself. Soviet propaganda, in a stroke of genius, personified winter. General Moroz, General Frost, was presented not as a suffering to be endured, but as a weapon to be wielded. The phrase, "General Winter is with us," spread like wildfire. Suddenly, the cold that was savaging Muscovites was seen as the same cold that was killing the Germans. The wind that whipped their faces was the same wind that blew snow onto enemy tanks. Nature, the vast, brutal Russian soul, was fighting alongside them. On the darkest, coldest nights, in the underground shelters of the Moscow metro, a sound could be heard above the distant din of war, the sound of singing. Voices joined together to sing the sacred war or old folk songs, melodies that spoke of love, loss, and the vastness of the Russian land. It was an act of cultural defiance, a statement that even though their bodies were under siege, their souls remained free. It was the voice of a people, trapped and bleeding, rediscovering their strength. So, while Hitler and his generals stared at the maps, waiting for Moscow's final collapse, the city burned. But it wasn't the fire of destruction. It was the fire of a furnace, the fire of fury, the fire of a newfound faith in itself. Moscow was burning, yes. It burned with the fierce hope that the longest night was about to end, and that the dawn, when it came, would be red. The fury of the bear and the stampede of the eagles, Zhukov's counteroffensive, Siberian thunder. On December 5, 1941, as the German generals, their noses frozen and their arrogance intact, planned the final assault on a Moscow they believed was on its knees, all hell broke loose beneath their feet. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, a man with a face carved from granite and eyes that held the coldness of the steppe itself, unleashed the Soviet counteroffensive. It wasn't a battle, it was an avalanche, a wave of steel, fire, and human fury that caught the world's most powerful war machine at its weakest moment. Zhukov's secret had been guarded with almost fanatical zeal. For weeks, while the German Army Group Center exhausted itself against Moscow's defenses, Zhukov accumulated strategic reserves. These were fresh troops, brought from the depths of Siberia and the Far East, men whose bodies and minds had been forged by winter. They did not fear the cold. They understood it, respected it, and knew how to use it to their advantage. Dressed in sheepskin coats, Valenki felt boots, and Ushanka hats, they were the antithesis of the German soldiers freezing in their summer uniforms. They were armed not only with rifles and bayonets, but with pure hatred and a sacred determination to defend every inch of the motherland. The offensive began hours before dawn, under a veil of blizzard and dense fog that seemed conjured by Zhukov himself. Thousands of Soviet soldiers, shrouded in white camouflage, advanced in eerie silence, their footsteps muffled by the soft snow. To the German sentries, exhausted, hungry, and half frozen at their posts, the world was a silent white blur. When the first artillery rounds ripped through the stillness, the sound was so disorienting that many thought it was winter thunder, a bizarre natural phenomenon. But then, the ground began to shake. T-34 tanks, whose diesel engines were less susceptible to freezing and whose wide tracks gave them superior mobility in deep snow, emerged from the fog like prehistoric beasts. They cut through the ice and snow like blades, their 76mm guns spewing fire and death. Shells exploded over the German positions, and the pure white snow was instantly stained with the dark color of earth and the bright red of blood. Next came the infantry. The Siberian soldiers attacked in human waves, shouting "Ura!", a guttural war cry that terrified the Germans. They did not advance in straight lines, but used the terrain, appearing and disappearing among the snowdrifts and trees, attacking the flanks, surrounding machine gun nests, and annihilating them with savage fury. In the frozen forests surrounding Moscow, the scene was even more terrifying. German patrols, already lost and demoralized, were hunted like animals. The ice, which had been their enemy, was now the ally of the partisans and Soviet troops. Every misstep, every broken twig betrayed the German position. Men slipped, fell, and were killed by a bayonet that emerged from the white before they could even get up. Escape was a trap. Many, in their panic, ran in circles, only to stumble over the frozen corpses of their own comrades, their faces a mask of eternal terror. As chaos consumed the German front line, Zhukov, from his underground command post, orchestrated the symphony of destruction with icy calm. Messengers on skis glided across the snow, carrying handwritten orders that transformed localized attacks into a coordinated and deadly offensive. Each Soviet advance was calculated to exploit a weakness, to cut a line of retreat, to push the Germans ever closer to disarray and total collapse. What had once been an organized battlefront was now an open-air slaughterhouse, trenches littered with frozen bodies, disemboweled horses, broken Panzer tanks, and countless men in field grey uniforms, frozen in postures of supplication or defiance. By the end of the first day, thousands of Germans lay dead or dying in the snow. But for the Red Army, every meter of land recaptured was a momentous victory. They weren't just driving out an invader, they were avenging their brothers, fathers, and sons who had died in the previous months. They were rewriting the narrative of the war, proving that the Russian giant, once awakened, was unstoppable. Zhukov's counteroffensive was not just a brilliant military maneuver, it was the roar of a wounded homeland, a primal and unequivocal warning to the world. Winter had weakened the invader, but now the Soviet army itself, attacked with the combined force of climate, land, and the accumulated fury of an entire people. The German advance was not merely stalled, it was doomed, and the survivors in their desperate retreat were beginning to grasp the terrible truth. The war in Russia would not be decided by tactics or technology, but by ice, hunger, and a despair as vast as the steppe itself. Want more gritty, true stories of war? Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. What remained of the glorious Wehrmacht, the force that had redefined warfare with its blitzkrieg, now crumbled like a sandcastle hit by the tide. Zhukov's relentless attack, combined with the relentless torture of cold and hunger, had broken the backbone of Army Group Center. Hitler's once invincible army had been transformed into a disorganized horde of exhausted and terrified men, whose only motivation was flight. The front lines, once drawn with Germanic precision on maps, had disintegrated into a series of isolated pockets of futile resistance. Huge gaps opened up in the front, and through them the Red Army advanced, often unopposed. The German retreat was not a tactical maneuver. It was a chaotic route. Soldiers, individually or in small groups, tried to retreat westward, but found only a white, hostile desert. Deep snow covered the roads, and the frozen corpses of their own comrades served as macabre landmarks. Every step required a monumental effort. Every breath of air in their lungs was like inhaling shards of glass. The famous German equipment failed spectacularly. The engines of Panzer tanks and Opel trucks, not designed for such temperatures, refused to start. Lubricating oil froze, metal parts contracted and broke. Vehicles worth a fortune were simply abandoned, becoming steel monuments to the arrogance of engineers who had ignored warnings about the Russian winter. The landscape was dotted with these iron giants, silent and covered in snow, like tombstones in a cemetery of ambition. The officers, many of them Prussian aristocrats who viewed discipline as an article of faith, tried desperately to restore order, but it was like trying to dam a river with their bare hands. Discipline, the bedrock of the Wehrmacht, had evaporated. Soldiers, maddened by hunger, fought like dogs over a piece of bread or a dead horse. Men who had fought side by side for months now killed each other for a pair of gloves or a blanket. Panic was a contagion that spread faster than any order. Messengers sent to re-establish contact with neighboring units simply disappeared into the endless white, swallowed by blizzards or a Soviet bullet. Orders, when they arrived, were often useless, referring to positions that had already been taken or to units that no longer existed. In contrast, the Red Army advanced with a precision that had previously been the Germans' trademark. Skier units flanked the retreating columns, setting deadly ambushes. The Cossack cavalry, which the Germans had derided as a relic of the past, proved terrifyingly effective, attacking supply convoys and terrorizing the rearguard. German trenches and defensive positions were taken with shocking ease. Soviet soldiers found their enemies not in fighting posture, but frozen to their posts, or already dead from hunger and cold. The Russian soil, which had drunk so much Soviet blood, was now sated with the blood of the invader. The moral collapse was complete. German troops, who had been indoctrinated to fight to the last man, began surrendering en masse. For many, surrendering to an enemy they considered subhuman was preferable to a slow, agonizing death from the cold. Groups of soldiers emerged from the forests with their hands raised, their faces a mixture of relief and shame. Others simply gave up. They sat in the snow, leaning against a tree, and waited for death to come, too tired to fight, to run, to feel. As winter reached its peak, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Celsius, -100 degrees Fahrenheit, a feeling of utter abandonment gripped what remained of the German command. The words circulating in the bunkers were no longer about strategy, but whispers of despair. "We have been betrayed. The Führer has abandoned us." The realization that Hitler, in his delirium, had prohibited any strategic retreat, condemning hundreds of thousands of his best soldiers to a pointless death, was the ultimate betrayal. What Hitler had called the greatest army in history was now a shadow, a ghost haunting the steppe. Faced with Zhukov's relentless advance and the untamed fury of winter, the truth became undeniable to all but the madman in Berlin. The dream of conquering Moscow was not only destroyed, it had become a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. The night terror, where shadows have bayonets. As night descended on the Russian front, it was not darkness that arrived, but a living, hungry entity. The sun, a pale, indifferent disk, sank below the horizon, and with it went the last semblance of normality. The night belonged to another world, a world of black and white, of silence and screams. The wind, a constant enemy during the day, at night transformed into a howling beast, an invisible predator whose roar carried not only snow, but the ghostly echoes of the dying, blending everything into a symphony of pure terror. It was in this blanket of darkness and sonic chaos that the exhausted and besieged Wehrmacht faced its most primordial enemy, the deadly silence that preceded the attack and the invisible fury of the Red Army. The Soviets had become children of the night. They attacked under the veil of darkness, not as an army, but as a pack of specters. Units of skiers, shrouded in white cloaks, moved with a ghostly fluidity, gliding through the snow without leaving a visible trace. They appeared out of nowhere, as if the snow itself had given birth to them, fired a deadly burst from their PPSH-41 submachine guns, plunged a bayonet into the chest of a sleepy sentry, and disappeared before any German's frozen brain could process what was happening. Every shot, every muffled cry of pain, echoed in the thin, icy air with the clarity of a bone breaking. The German soldiers, already at the limit of their physical and mental endurance, could not discern where the attack came from, where it ended, or whether it was real or merely a product of their fevered minds. The explosions of mortars and grenades were the only source of light, but it was a light that revealed only more horror. For a split second, the white landscape was illuminated by an orange glare, revealing scenes of a frozen hell. The bodies of comrades in grotesque postures, abandoned tanks that looked like the carcasses of leviathans, and horses impaled on icy spikes, their eyes wide with eternal astonishment. The acrid smell of gunpowder, the metallic odor of hot blood vaporizing in the cold air, and the stench of burning flesh mingled, creating a suffocating, almost unbreathable atmosphere. Many German soldiers, blinded by fear, snow, and darkness, fired their weapons haphazardly, their tracer bullets drawing desperate arcs in the blackness, until the dull click of the firing pin announced that the ammunition was exhausted. Others, panicked, tried to retreat, only to stumble over the stiff, frozen bodies of their comrades, falling into a tangle of stiff limbs from which they could no longer rise. With each passing night, the attrition rate became unsustainable. Officers, their voices hoarse and broken, shouted orders that the wind stole and carried away. Men whose bodies had consumed their last reserves of energy simply collapsed in the snow, overcome by exhaustion, frostbite, or sheer terror, and were left behind, their groans quickly silenced by the cold. The madness became an epidemic. Soldiers, their eyes bulging with white fever, rose from their trenches and ran into the darkness, screaming at ghosts only they could see, until a bullet or the cold itself silenced them. Others were swallowed by the anti-personnel mines the partisans had sown beneath the snow. The explosion was a dull, almost discreet thud, and the man simply disappeared, his remains blending into the indifferent white landscape. The cold, which during the day was a methodical torturer, at night became an active killer, working in collusion with the enemy. Every breath was an icy knife to the lungs. Every movement was agony. Even the bravest veterans, men who had faced the fires of hell at Stalingrad, realized that here, in the Russian night, there was no shelter. no defense. Night transformed the battlefield into a theater of invisible death, where the cold and the Soviets were two arms of the same monster, turning each hour of darkness into a nightmare from which many would never wake. For the Germans, terror no longer came solely from the threat of a bullet or a piece of shrapnel. It came from the night itself, from the howling of the wind, from the snow that seemed to have a life of its own, swallowing up tracks, muffling sounds, and concealing a death that could come from any direction, at any moment. Every survivor who saw the sunrise knew with a soul-deepening certainty that many of the familiar faces from the night before were gone forever. The frozen silence of dawn, punctuated only by the crackling of ice, was more terrifying than the most intense artillery barrage. And so, in the beating heart of the Russian night, the Wehrmacht finally understood that it was not fighting an army, but the land itself, against primal and implacable forces, the darkness, the snow, and the fury of a desecrated homeland. Fear was no longer a psychological state, it was a physical condition, tangible, sharp, and above all, deadly. If this story gripped you, subscribe. Decades of battles await the horror of the Russian winter, already indescribable in its magnitude, reached its peak of macabre surrealism when Soviet reconnaissance patrols began making a discovery that defied logic and the very nature of death. They found German soldiers frozen in place, alone or in small groups, as if time and life had been instantly ripped from them. Men who, hours or days before, had marched with the arrogance of conquerors were now statues of ice, eternal sentinels at a post that no longer existed. They stood motionless, silent, gripping their rifles with fingers that had fused to the metal, their open glassy eyes fixed on a horizon they would never reach. They were dead, but their bodies refused to fall. The scene was so bizarre that initial reports were met with disbelief, but the evidence was undeniable. They were men frozen in mid-motion, an officer with his hand raised as if about to give an order, a radio operator with headphones on his head, his mouth half open as if mid-transmission, a soldier kneeling, aiming his rifle, his index finger frozen a millimeter from the trigger. From their mouths and nostrils hung delicate ice crystals, their last breath transformed into a macabre jewel. The skin, stretched taut over the bones of their faces, had acquired a blue-grey hue, hard and translucent as porcelain. The muscles, frozen in a state of instant rigor mortis, defied gravity. They were human monuments to futility, a terrifying testament to the violence with which the cold could kill. For the Soviet soldiers, hardened men accustomed to the brutality of war, the sight was deeply disturbing. A young Siberian lieutenant, upon encountering an entire platoon frozen in marching formation, made the sign of the cross, an instinctive gesture that transcended communist ideology. He realized that winter was not just an ally, it was a pagan deity, an ancient god of the land who demanded sacrifices of blood and ice. With every step, his patrols encountered more of these ghostly figures, creating an open-air wax museum of German defeat. But if for the Soviets the sight was ominous, for the Germans who still managed to advance or retreat, it was a devastating blow to morale. Seeing their friends and comrades, men with whom they had shared bread and cigarettes, transformed into ice sculptures was the embodiment of their worst nightmare. Death no longer came just from a bullet they could hear or an explosion they could see. It came from the very air they breathed, from the snow beneath their feet, from the cold that slowly consumed them from the inside out. Every patrol that failed to return, every soldier left behind, reinforced a collective paralyzing fear. Winter took no prisoners. Diaries found on the bodies of the dead and in the pockets of the few survivors describe the devastating psychological impact of this ordeal. A Hamburg artillery sergeant wrote, "We marched, and there they were. Klaus from the 3rd Company, Peter, the boy from Cologne, motionless, staring at us, their eyes were covered with a thin layer of ice, but I swear they watched us pass. It was as if Russia itself had turned them into gargoyles to haunt us. It was impossible to move forward without feeling that the entire world, the sky, the earth, was alive and hated us with every fiber of its being. This was the most visible and unmistakable sign that the Wehrmacht had encountered an enemy that could not be defeated with tactics, courage, or ammunition. The cold had frozen not only the bodies, but the very soul of the army, its dreams of conquest, its sense of purpose, and the spirit of hundreds of thousands of men. As the wind howled between these human statues, whistling through their tattered uniforms, the truth became as clear and hard as the ice beneath their feet. General Winter had become the supreme commander of the Russian battlefield, and he would accept no surrender. He would offer no mercy. He would hear no excuses. Every step forward was now a gamble against time, against nature itself, and against the ever-present specter of icy death. Subscribe to see the truth behind the campaigns. No sugarcoating, just facts. When the sun, a pale, disinterested eye, finally dared to rise above the horizon, its light brought neither warmth nor hope. Instead, it poured over the endless white of the Russian steppe like a chemical reagent, revealing the true, terrifying scale of the catastrophe. What remained of the German battlefront was a profound, absolute, and deathly silence. It was not the peace that followed the storm, but the emptiness that took the place of life. The sound of marching boots, the roar of Panzer engines, the cries of command and agony, all had been erased. What remained was only the sound of the world itself, in its most primordial state, the piercing whistle of the wind blowing over an open-air cemetery, a museum of frozen bodies, abandoned tanks like the carcasses of steel beasts, and long, dark trails of blood congealed in the snow, like the brushstrokes of a mad artist. The chaos of battle had passed, but it had left behind a landscape of death and desolation so vast and still it seemed to belong to another planet. The few German soldiers who survived the night and the offensive moved through this landscape not like men, but like ghosts. They walked with hunched shoulders, their eyes glazed and fixed on the ground, avoiding the gaze of the ice statues that had once been their comrades. Their steps were slow, dragging, each movement a painful negotiation with a body that had already given up. Each breath was a struggle against the air that burned their lungs like acid. They did not speak. Language had become superfluous in the face of the magnitude of the defeat. What was there to say? They counted the dead not with their fingers, but with their hearts, and with each friend they found, a part of their own humanity shattered and froze. To see a trench comrade with whom he had shared a cigarette hours earlier, now an ice sculpture with his mouth open in a silent scream, was the most brutal reminder of the price paid for the arrogance of marching on Moscow without due respect to its oldest and most implacable guardian, winter. The only sound that persisted was the symphony of decay. It was the sharp, dry crack of a tank's metal buried in the snow, contracting in the extreme cold. It was the spectral whistle of gases escaping from a destroyed vehicle. It was the rustle of wind on a shred of torn uniform caught on a branch. The dead horses, frozen in agonized positions, seemed to scream silently. The smell of iron, cold gunpowder, and slow, frozen decomposition mingled with the pure, icy air, creating a perfume of annihilation. Even the wind seemed heavy, as if carrying with it the murmurs, the last words, and the unspoken sighs of tens of thousands of men who had fallen. For the Soviets, cautiously advancing through this same landscape, the silence had a completely different meaning. It was not the silence of death, but the silence of vengeance. It was the mute testimony of the motherland's resilience, the final proof that the Red Army and the Soviet people had survived where the world's most feared war machine had failed. Every German trench retaken, now silent and filled with dead. Every village liberated, every Russian soldier remaining standing after weeks of hellish fighting, represented not only survival, but the victory of life over white death, the victory of the earth over the invader. In the diaries found in the pockets of dead German officers, these scenes were described with the clarity of despair. Major von Harden, a Prussian aristocrat, wrote in his last entry, "The silence. It's worse than artillery. The noise of battle, however terrible, is the sound of struggle, of possibility. This silence is the sound of the end. It's the absolute certainty that there will be no salvation, that every man we leave behind will never see another dawn. The snow isn't just covering our dead, it's burying us alive. It's the shroud of our army and our pride. We are irretrievably defeated." And so, the battlefront that had once symbolized the triumphal march and invincibility of the Third Reich became a frozen landscape of defeat, an epitaph written in ice and blood. Chaos, hunger and cold had completed their work with terrifying efficiency. The survivors, on their ghostly march to nowhere, knew that the war in Russia had changed forever. It would no longer be decided by tactics, but by endurance, not by tanks, but by the ability to endure pain, not against an army, but against an invisible killer called winter. The silence after the chaos was more than the absence of noise. It was a sentence. It was the final verdict, etched in the ice, in the bodies, and in the shattered minds of all who still breathed. It was proof that in the vastness of Russia, human arrogance is but a brief, insignificant sound, quickly swallowed by the eternal silence of the big snow. What remained of the Wehrmacht, the pride of the Third Reich, was now moving backward. But this was no tactical retreat, no strategic maneuver to regroup and fight another day. It was a rout, a chaotic, dishonorable, and deeply humiliating escape. What had once been an invincible army, a steel serpent stretching hundreds of kilometers, was now a procession of specters, a long, winding funeral truce dragging itself through the deep snow. They carried their wounded, their broken weapons, their torn flags, and above all the crushing, unbearable weight of absolute defeat. The soldiers, automatons driven by a final instinct for survival, tried to escape the white hell they themselves had created. But the roads, which on the way there had been the path to glory, on the way back became death traps. The treacherous black ice betrayed them at every step. Trucks and armored vehicles, their engines frozen, got stuck in snowbanks that seemed to grip them like claws. The horses, already skeletal and exhausted, simply collapsed, their large bodies sinking into the snow, their dull eyes reflecting the grey sky before fading. And the men who could no longer go on, whose feet were black with gangrene or whose lungs had frozen, were simply left behind. They were abandoned to the white death that awaited them, a patient and hungry presence at the roadside. Some officers, still clinging to a last shred of authority, were dragged along by their desperate troops, shouting orders to restore an order that no longer existed, their voices lost in a sea of despair that could no longer be contained. Hunger and cold, the two relentless generals of the Russian army, gave no respite. They were predators that hunted the weak relentlessly. Soldiers with swollen eyelids glued shut by the ice, nearly blind, chewed on anything their hands could find. Leather strips from their own belts, the bark of a lone tree, the remains of an emergency ration that had turned into a block of ice. Many were so weak, so consumed by malnutrition and hypothermia, that simply holding a rifle was an impossible task. They simply dropped it in the snow and continued to crawl, or sat and waited, with terrifying calm, for Soviet patrols to find them, or for the snow to cover them forever. Each day of retreat seemed to last an eternity, and every meter of advance westward was paid with an exorbitant price in human lives. Morale was no longer an issue. It had ceased to exist. Men who months before had sung marching songs and dreamed of conquering Moscow now wept silently, the tears freezing instantly on their dirty, bearded faces. They murmured to themselves, conversing with ghosts, their wife in Berlin, their children in Munich, their home village in Bavaria. These were memories of a world that seemed so distant and impossible it might as well have been a dream. Some, in a final spasm of defiance, let out screams of pure rage and frustration against the sky, against Hitler, against God. But no one responded. Only the wind howled, a funeral wail that carried their voices into the white nothingness. And behind them, ever close, came the Red Army. They were not an army in pursuit. They were wolves following a wounded herd. Units of skiers and Cossack cavalry attacked the flanks of the retreating column, harassing them, burning what few supplies remained, and capturing or annihilating the groups of soldiers who had strayed. It was a relentless pursuit, a slow, methodical, a bloodletting. Every surviving German knew with a soul-chilling certainty that there was no refuge, no safe haven, only a desperate race against time and death. For Hitler, in his warm and distant headquarters, the retreat was a betrayal, an unacceptable shame that stained the Reich's honor. For the soldiers on the ground, it was living, breathing proof of absolute failure. Months of victories and conquests, the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of men, all had been destroyed by the blind. Pride of a leader, the brutality of the cold, and the lethal strategy of Stalin and his generals. The dream of Moscow had turned into a nightmare of snow and blood, and the remaining men marched no longer to conquer, but simply to try, against all odds, to reach the border alive. The Russian winter, merciless and silent, became the final judge of that campaign. It spared no one. Every road that had once been a route of triumphant advance became a corridor of suffering and death. Every step left behind was marked by a frozen body, an abandoned tank, a dead horse. The German retreat was not just a strategic defeat, it was a historic defeat, a lesson in humility etched in iron and ice in the snow, pain and blood of an empire that believed itself invincible. And then came the moment the world would never forget. The victory of General Winter. There were no trophies, no flags raised, only the heavy silence of a devastated front, where snow now covered the remains of what had once been an army that claimed to be invincible. Hitler had underestimated Russia, the cold, and the spirit of a people determined to survive, and he paid a price that would never be forgotten. The roads, once lined with tanks and trucks, were now dotted with abandoned cars, frozen bodies and broken weapons. The ground seemed to absorb the blood and ice into a macabre tapestry that told the story of Germany's defeat. Every step across the countryside was a reminder of the cost of pride and arrogance. The Red Army advanced not only with weapons, but with the cold itself as an ally. Soviet patrols moved among the dead, reclaiming positions, establishing trenches, and burying the German survivors who still fought their way to the border. The wind carried their voices, not of despair, but of victory. Each cry was a reminder that the homeland had resisted, that Russia could not be conquered. Stalin watched silently from Moscow as the world began to realize that the Wehrmacht had been crushed not just by men, but by a winter that seemed alive, relentless and strategic. The snow hid the bodies, but it also told a story of resistance, courage, and extreme suffering. Every advancing Soviet soldier felt the presence of this invisible general, the cold, and knew he was on the right side of history. German pride, once a symbol of conquest and power, had been buried beneath layers of snow, hunger, and fear. And in the white expanse of Russia, General Winter stood supreme, silent, and absolute, reminding the world that not every enemy needs bullets to win. Sometimes The cold patience and relentless nature. Operation Barbarossa, which began with the promise of a quick triumph, ended in a bloody and brutal lesson. In Russia, even winter becomes a weapon, an ally, and a judge. And so the story of the greatest winter of the war is not just about men or tanks, but about overwhelming force of a country and its climate, which transformed months of arrogance into a white nightmare that will forever be etched in the memory of the war.